The way I see it, there's two types of people. Those who spend their lives trying to build a future, and those who spend their lives trying to rebuild the past. For too long, I've been stuck in between, hidden in the dark. I decided that I was gonna die sober, not drunk. At least then I would see who shot me.
Max's story through the progression of Max Payne 3 is a unique one. We catch up with him in the middle of a downward spiral that's been building since the events of the previous games. Sitting at a bar, drinking himself to death and popping painkillers, just to numb himself even more. But the game also works as a turning point for him, and calling it nothing more than Max just leaving the US for Brazil so he can kill indiscriminately and raise the stakes even higher does his story an incredible injustice. It takes failure, and more than one failure, for him to finally face what's happening to him. He has to come to terms with the fact that he isn't just accepting a job to start over. At least, not in any simple or honest sense. Whether he really believed that himself is another story, but death, personal loss, his own failure, and maybe my favorite part of Max Payne's narrative, the way it all unfolds, are exactly what makes this game and his story so unique. It's all told in hindsight, and as Max even says in the game, nothing ever makes sense to him in the moment. It only starts to click later, once he had the distance to step back, connect the dots, and ask questions he couldn't wrap his head around just a few days earlier. For us, Max is introduced at the end of what he was doing in Brazil, after he has already discovered that he was lied to and used. His own notoriety, along with the personal hatred he has for himself, was taken advantage of and turned against him for the benefit of other people. That alone already says a lot about the position he's in before the story really starts to unravel before us. But as the game rewinds and slowly takes us through the events that led Max to the moment where he's standing over a man crawling for his life, we start to understand just how much of this whole situation has been shaped by failure, regrets, and the way he looks back on his own decisions. He reflects, projects self-doubt, and constantly questions what even got him here in the first place. A failed ransom exchange leads him to reflect on when Raul Passos found him in New Jersey, supposedly on a recruiting drive for private security work Max was never fully sold on. His doubt within himself and this work continues to come back to the forefront through his setbacks and inability to properly protect the people he was hired to keep safe. Then Fabiana's death brings all of those old feelings back again. It reminds him of failing to protect his wife and baby daughter, and how that failure ended up pushing him out of New Jersey and into this line of work in the first place. It becomes this repeated loop of being unable to save the so-called damsel in distress, and even though the situations are different, the emotional weight behind them is all the same. He keeps getting pulled back into the same kind of loss, the same kind of helplessness, and the same kind of guilt. And then when his boss is killed, he learns that it wasn't actually his boss who was the target at all, but Max himself.
Hey! Why?
What?
Why Rodrigo Bronco?
Why? What?
Why did you come to kill Rodrigo Bronco?
Came to kill you! Because of what you did to us! You killed so many of us!
Through his own actions, he becomes a target, gets distracted, fails to keep the man he was hired to protect safe, and as a result, ends up facing the consequences of his own mistakes. That's what then pushes him towards sobriety. At the very least, it's the one thing he can do that feels like a real attempt to take back some control. If he's going to die here, then the least he can do is do it with enough dignity to see who shot him. What makes all of this so impactful, so compelling, is that the story's never just about the action happening in front of Max. It's about how he continues to collapse inward, how every disaster connects back to the last one, and how his guilt continues to build until he's finally forced to face it all. Really, that's why I believe the structure and overall presentation of the game matters so much. Nothing happens in chronological order. We experience it all with Max processing it after the fact. And it's that hindsight that is distinctly a Max Payne experience. And so while it might be easier to sit here and explain it within the context of Raul Passos first heading to New Jersey on what he claims was a recruiting drive to pick up a retired cop who he tried to make believe were in the same class at the police academy together, it would be a disservice to the story of starting there, and not at the natural moment of right when Max stops as he's about to put a bullet into Becker's head, and begins to reflect on everything he has been through since arriving at Sao Paulo.
You're right. It wasn't doing me any favors. Maybe I'd lost my self-respect, but it's back. I'm excited. Really. I really needed a new start.
Now, I don't usually spend much time talking about music or a game's prologue, but this is one of those rare cases where it really is important. The prologue gives us a clear look into Max's mindset, how he's adjusting, or more accurately, how he isn't, and the emotional spiral that he's stuck in. All of this begins with the music. Max Payne's original theme redone by Health hits on multiple levels. It signals his arrival, sure, but it also feels like a return, almost like he's circling back to something he never really left behind. That feeling gets reinforced immediately by Max himself. He sarcastically calls this new place great, says he's going to settle in, that it's time to move on and get on with his life.
This place is great, really comfortable. I'm just gonna get settled in. Time to move on. Get on with my life. Yes, absolutely.
The way he says it and how he answers himself makes it obvious he doesn't believe anything he says. To him, moving doesn't change a single thing. You see that in how he moves through the apartment. He just kind of drifts around, restless. He eventually sits down, keeps staring at his bag, anxiously, like there's something in there he doesn't want to deal with, but can't quite ignore. And eventually he pulls out a picture of his family and starts talking to himself again, brushing it off as something that happened a long time ago, telling himself to just let go and move on. But then he leaves. When he comes back, he's carrying a black plastic bag full of alcohol. He talks about how this place suits him more than Hoboken or Panama, which is an interesting thing to say because now we know he's already been to Panama. And the game does go on to explain that later, but bringing up Hoboken to connect all three places, it makes it clear that no matter where he really goes, nothing actually changes. He's doing the same thing everywhere. Drinking, popping pills, trying to numb himself. There's almost no point in the moves because his pattern, the cycle that he's stuck in, never actually changed from one place to the other. He's just going through the motions. He even says he's got his self-respect back, but it comes off as a joke. He tries to convince himself he's excited this time, but again, it just doesn't really hit. Visually, the game backs all of this up. You get these flashes between the balcony in Sao Paulo and the rooftops of New Jersey, and in both, he's holding a drink. In his mind, there's no real difference between the two of them. At this point, whatever sense of dignity he had is basically gone. He admits he's only occasionally bored of drinking all the time, and he questions whether this move was ever really necessary. Underneath all of that, he's still dealing with the same pain and anger from losing his wife and daughter. It builds up until he lashes out and throws their portrait against the wall. After that, he finishes off an entire bottle of whiskey and heads to the kitchen for another. And then the scene changes. He's suddenly back in the bar at Hoboken, raising a toast to a bartender who really isn't there. Snapping back to it, he turns around, pours himself a drink, then goes on to bend down to pick up the picture he threw. And in that moment of retrieval, it turns back into him kneeling at his family's grave, placing flowers down. Then he comes back to the present, he's still holding the photo. He breaks down for a second, and then gently places it face down on the table. The whole sequence lays everything out. Where he's been, what he's been doing, and what he's going through. The theme ties it all together. This particular song is used so deliberately throughout the game, and here, it really drives home how tragic his state of mind is. This is his theme, and these flashes between past and present, the sudden angry outbursts, the ways he tries to convince himself of things he clearly doesn't believe, that's our window into his mind. It's one of the few times we see it this clearly laid out. Yeah, we see the drinking later and the self-doubts never really goes away, but this kind of anger, this jumping back and forth between where he is now, everything he's lost, and how he's struggling to cope isn't shown like this again. Not in this way, and not this directly tied to his wife and daughter or the reality he's currently stuck in. This is his arrival in Sao Paulo, or more accurately, this is how he remembers it, the way it plays back in his head. From there, he gets up, still holding his bottle of whiskey, and that's what transitions us into what is actually the real present. He's walking towards a man crawling for his life, and while he's doing that, he begins to reflect on how he ended up here. How he became exactly what these people wanted him to be, a killer. Someone driven by anger, someone who doesn't really have the sensibilities anymore to tell right from wrong. And in his mind, through that acknowledgement, they won. They were right about him. He wouldn't know right from wrong even if it was staring him directly in the face. And yeah, in this moment, he's technically the one in control, about to execute this man, but what does that actually mean if in the end they were right about him anyway? He played his role to the fullest. That's the part that I think bugs him the most. He can't shake it that how could he be so blind? This brings us straight into the first mission, called Something Rotten in the Air. Through Max's own narration, he tells us that he arrived in Sao Paulo, Brazil just a few weeks before on a security detail. He's working protection in a city where, as far as he's concerned, everything seemed fine. He doesn't speak the language, but they don't water down the drinks, and for him, that's more than enough. That's really all he cares about at this point. Even though we're hearing all of this from Max, it's actually Raul Passos, his partner, who then goes on to fill in more on what's actually going on here. He explains that this is a charity event. The whole idea is to let the guests drink, socialize, and donate money for the kids. Passos is also the one paying close attention to the entire situation surrounding them. He points out that security downstairs feels shaky, that something's off, and that Max should look alive. There's this uneasy feeling in the air that he just can't quite explain. But Max just brushes it off, says that there's always something rotten in the air. The people they're here to protect are local celebrities, and Max doesn't think very highly of them at all. He describes them as rich parasites with delusions about humanity, and that by itself says a lot about his mindset going into this. But beyond that, there's something else happening here too. Nothing is really connecting for him. Things are right in front of him and he just doesn't put them quite together just yet. Because almost every major player tied to what's coming later is here. Rodrigo Branco is the main one, a wealthy Brazilian businessman and real estate mogul. He's the reason Max and Passos are even there. Alongside him is his wife Fabiana and his two brothers, Marcelo and Victor. And Max is quick to share his opinions on all of them. With Rodrigo, Max focuses more on his business side, but he also comments on his relationship with Fabiana. From his perspective, it's pretty surface level. She wants to be seen as hot and dangerous, and the two of them seem to get along mostly by ignoring each other. Rodrigo's too busy working, and Fabiana's too busy just enjoying his money. And then there's the age gap. That's quite obvious. It's hard not to get the sense that she's much more interested in the lifestyle and the money than, of course, Rodrigo himself. So she makes up for it by spending more time with Marcelo, the younger brother. He isn't exactly the sharpest, and he's far more interested in partying than anything else going on around him. And then there's Victor, the middle brother, a local politician and easily the slimiest one in Max's eyes. And almost on cue, Victor walks in, greets Becker, and the two of them leave together pretty quickly. Becker, better known as Colonel Armando Becker, is the head of the 55th Battalion of the city's police force. Passos describes him as anti-gang and is often associated with UFE. Now at this point, that's all we really get. Later on, it becomes clear just how corrupt Becker, UFE, and Victor actually are. But from Becker, we then have Arthur Fisher. Now publicly, Arthur Fisher's known as a famous plastic surgeon, and so naturally it makes sense for someone like him to be here. Status, connections, this crowd fits him. The same goes for Becker. From a security and influence standpoint, both of them make a lot of sense in being present here. But just like Becker, Arthur would eventually end up being tied to something incredibly dark. He's connected to a secret underground organ harvesting operation that's directly tied to UFE, Becker, and Victor. Now, of course, we'll get into all of that much later, but for now, that's important and something I wanted to point out because both of these characters, who end up being extremely important later in the game, are introduced right here at the very beginning. They're right in front of Max. They're part of the same room, rubbing elbows with the exact same people, are closely tied to each other, yet none of it fully registers quite yet. Now, to be completely fair, there's really no real way for any of this to register quite yet. It's not like Max could realistically piece all of this together within this moment. But the reason I keep pointing out that nothing connects for him here is because he's still going through the motions. He's drinking on the job, he completely disregards the warnings Passos gave him, and he's not really engaging with anything happening around him in any meaningful way. Even after the Commando Sombra crashes the charity event in an attempt to kidnap Rodrigo Branco, nothing really changes for him. Later that night, Max goes right back home and falls into the exact same routine. Popping pills, drinking nonstop, until he eventually throws up and sends himself to bed. He's not okay. Even if he comes across as somewhat sober, at the very least clear-headed enough to go in and rescue Fabiano and Rodrigo, there's still something off about him. And I think there's a really nice detail here that quietly reinforces all of this. Earlier when I talked about Max's theme music, I mentioned how the game uses it very deliberately. and that starts to show up as early as this first mission. Right before he slides off the roof to go after Fabiana, there's a room with a piano inside of it. Max can actually stop and interact with it.
It wasn't the time, and I was still a little rusty. But the tune was coming together.
Now wasn't the time. He might have been a little rusty, or more accurately, as he puts it, the tune was coming back to him. The way his story over the last couple games tend to move, the same pattern of his life that keeps flowing into this never-ending tragedy. Within the context of the game's story, and even putting Max's personal habits aside for a second, he wasn't there for himself, he was being sent to save Fabiana, as she was taken by the Comando Sombra, one of the most powerful criminal organizations within Sao Paulo, that just moments earlier crashed the charity events. Now, Comando Sombra are known for moving cocaine, MDMA, meth. They're a major drug distributor. But occasionally they get into the business of kidnapping celebrities and politicians and holding them for ransom. And that's exactly what the whole point of this job was, to kidnap members of the Bronco family. They would go on to take Rodrigo, Marcelo, and Fabiana. And Max's first reaction, well, he calls himself and Passos two idiots now in charge of the situation. And he starts talking about whether he's lost his edge, or more so afraid that he has lost his edge. It's an interesting line by Max because this charity event within Sao Paulo isn't the first time working with Passos, nor is it the first time that their job together has ever went horribly south. This would be his third job. The second job that took place in Panama was arguably much worse than this. They were on a boat when it got hit by a right-wing paramilitary group called the UAP, or the United Souls of the People. Essentially, it boiled down to a massive massacre. Everyone on board was killed except for Max, Marcelo, and Passos. Max was so out of it that during the UAP's takeover of the yacht, he was out cold, completely unaware that the yacht had docked within the Panama Canal, and everyone had either been killed on board or already disembarked, with Max being the last person on board, finally waking up from a drunken stupor. For that job, he and Passos were apparently hired to keep a woman by the name of Daphne Bernstein safe. But since she had turned up among the piles of dead bodies, it's safe to say that that job was an utter failure. So with Max afraid that he had lost his edge while heading over to save Fabiana following the failure of the Panama Canal job, either betrays that this job was much more personal and significant to him, or he was so wasted on the yachts that by comparison this is just much higher for him. I'd wager these are the two best options, with the possible third of either not remembering or chalking it up to just not really doing the job right since he was completely passed out. These make much more sense to me than saying anything remotely close to him being in a better state, because truthfully he isn't. And there's no quest for sobriety or attempt to stop feeling so sorry for himself for quite some time. But after headshotting Fabiana's captor, saving her, it appears Becker was able to rescue Marcelo from the Comando Sombra, and Max decides to head after Rodrigo Bronco. Truthfully, there's not much else noteworthy here apart from as Max is fighting through the hotel and eventually the parking structure after successfully rescuing Rodrigo. He witnesses the UFE arriving, executing injured members of the Comando Sombra, as another man shows up with the regular police force in an effort to stop them and spare these men. From here, he and Becker begin to argue with each other as Passos attempts to explain what he can, as it's pretty clear to both Max and ourselves that there are two different, at least police forces or security agencies here. That explanation basically amounts to this as the regular police, but it's all politics, it's hard for him to keep up. Truthfully, in keeping with the theme of showing us people that'll be much more important later on, we'll learn that this man is Wilson Da Silva. He's a good, honest cop actively working to take down Becker, Ufe, and Becker's right-hand man, Bachmeier. It's again one of those beautifully staged scenes that highlights the odds these men are at, showing us the kind of person Silva is by attempting to render aid to the one man he was able to save from execution by Ufe. For Max, though, the day's over, heading home right back to his preferable method of R&R, taking painkillers and drinking until he can't stand, eventually throwing up and putting himself to sleep. That's until we come back, only 5 days later, appearing in a private helicopter with Fabiana, Marcelo, and Fabiano's sister, Giovanna. Max's cynicism on the whole situation again shines through, mentioning how he's ferrying the boss's broad and his dipshit of a brother for the night to escape their brush with mortality, thinking Giovanna was only brought along so that Fabiana could show off how rich and empty her life was. A stark difference from Giovanna, who Fabiana claims is the good sister since she volunteers her time within the favela, helping out the unfortunate. Giovanna would then also go on to share with her sister that more bodies turned up and people are going missing within the favela. Yet another clue for how everything ties back and is circling all around Max. But that doesn't concern him. He's so in his own head, separate from the people he's looking out for, that it takes Marcelo multiple attempts to get his attention. The distance continues on the ride in the elevator. Maybe this is just a mistaken perception on my part as well, but when they get off of the elevator, Marcelo and Fabiana are rushed by the club manager, Max still kind of keeps his distance. He isn't overly protective over them in the sense of demanding space or ordering the manager to just back off. He's just there quietly keeping an eye on them. Granted, he does throw a man to the side when he stops Giovanna, but it's more a minor nuisance, and he just keeps walking to the VIP area where, coincidentally, the bar's located. Because, as he says, this place is exactly what he hates. By his own admission, he needed a real drink to deal with the electronic music and robotic people. As Marcelo is flipping out over losing his VIP spot to Claudio, a big and upcoming football player, Max heads over to the bar to request his drink. Yet again, just appearing to go through the motions, the entire sequence from riding on the helicopter to coming down the elevator and slowly making his way over to the bar, or to be fair, the VIP lounge with Marcelo. This all goes to show his feelings towards Marcelo, Fabiana, and the fact they needed a private helicopter to head to a nightclub in order to escape the terrifying near-death experience that they had less than a week before. A terrifying experience you would think that would force them all to reconsider venturing out or doing so without added security. The fact that there was a violent gang bold enough and capable enough to infiltrate the charity event, take multiple people, and have over 50 armed gunmen should have raised alarms and demanded extra precautions. But then again, maybe this is all meant to add to the slip-ups. It's no mistake Marcelo, who Max viewed the lowest out of the brothers, would be the one taken out next when the Comando Sombra had launched another attack, and at a place where Max wasted no time in dulling his senses, outright scoffing at Marcelo's question of what he does about everything, about life. You can't ask him, as he's quick to point out that he's in a club listening to music that he can't stand, he's thousands of miles away from home, he's armed, and he's drinking. He's the least person to take advice from. The last comment by Max is funny by acknowledging he's drinking and armed, but I also believe there is significance in all of that. He's outright admitting to Marcelo that he has no control over his life at all. Would he be here if he did otherwise? He's not the one to walk up to and ask how to navigate misfortune or unfortunate circumstances. He's spent far too long rubber banding on his own. As Max orders his second glass, Serrano, leader of the Comando Sombra, orders his men to attack. This is yet another moment you wouldn't pick up on without playing the game a few times to notice that it's Serrano here, but it triggers his men to snatch Giovanna and Fabiana off the dance floor, the man in the VIP room with Max and Marcelo, to snatch Marcelo, and in a moment of bravery, Claudio, that up-and-coming football player, going over and attempting to play hero. The man then shoots him, giving Marcelo an opportunity to run and Max to tackle the man through the glass and take out the gunman on the dance floor. The rest of the mission amounts to Max attempting to race and get to Fabiana and Giovanna before they leave. Because he even admits the way things are going, the women are either going to be held for ransom or killed on the spot. And he may have been successful last time in thwarting their attempts of kidnapping Rodrigo and his wife, but this time he practically allowed the Comando Sombra to leave with 2 people. While still incredibly early within the story and Max's own eventual desire to get clean, the failure during the nightclub is full of Max's own acknowledgement of drinking on the job, messing up, and one of the most iconic things about these games is the many comments Max has throughout the missions. Max Payne 3 is no different here, with one such line being one that could easily be missed should you never walk behind a bar while trailing after the women.
All this unfinished business, and all I could think about was my unfinished scotch.
Despite his push to save these girls, his mind is elsewhere, a symptom of his own state of mind and yet another peek into the pool he has. Yes, he has unfinished business and acknowledges it's about time he does his job, but he still can't help but think about that second glass of scotch he wasn't able to finish. Better yet, linking it as a cause of his failure. Later, when Max goes on to rendezvous with Passos and Marcelo, who managed to find his own way back safely to Passos, the pair end up facing a dilemma. They're forced to make a difficult decision of leaving Fabiana behind as she was shoved into a helicopter that Giovanna would have been put into as well. But thanks to the arrival of Passos and Max, the woman's captor's attention was stolen just long enough to provide an opportunity for Giovanna to run away, leading to Passos and Max to let Fabiana fly away while Passos flies the helicopter close to Giovanna so Max could provide air support, protecting her as she tries to make an escape. Eventually, she does manage to hide inside a building while Max jumps off the helicopter to head after her, during which he admits to himself that this entire job is a giant mess. He questions where Passos is. Even though he was flying the helicopter, where the hell is his backup? He's ultimately running blindly into God knows what in an attempt to find this girl that, as far as Max can tell, is being hunted aggressively by this gang, who either desperately wanted these women or were under the impression that the Bronco security detail was far more than just two has-beens. Max also admits that he and Passos were two failed cops, failing even worse at being personal bodyguards. And thanks to Passos basically approaching all of his problems with as little preparation as Max does, it may have been why they got along so well. In addition to their failures and lack of preparation, there was also Giovanna. Max's weakness was alcohol, while Passos' was Giovanna. When you look at everything leading up to this, it really doesn't add up. There had already been attempts to take Fabiana, she was declared a target, alongside most likely Marcelo, and on top of that, she is Rodrigo's wife. And Max was essentially brought in to protect her and Marcelo. That was his and Passos' job. Giovanna matters too, obviously, she's family, she's around them, and when she's in their presence, she naturally falls under the protection as well. So I'm not saying she should be ignored or left behind, but when things go bad, priorities do matter. And in that moment of deciding between going after Fabiana in the helicopter or hovering above Giovanna and providing air support and keeping her safe, they're completely flipped upside down. Instead of sticking to the original objective, going after Fabiana, which is what Max initially pushed for, they pivot. They go after Giovanna at Passos' recommendation. And there's no real pushback from Max, no second guessing or any kind of argument whatsoever, he just goes along with it. To be fair, time is of the essence, but still, at least a little resistance would have made more sense. But both of them lose focus. They took their eyes off of what actually mattered in the moment. And for Passos, it was extremely personal. His feelings for Giovanna pull him in that direction, even if it means chasing the wrong person, which is something Max realizes afterward.
Giovanna! Hey! No, nothing. Go.
Seems like I wasn't the only guy around here who had taken his eye off the ball.
Are you okay?
My weakness was the drink. Passos was the sister. Things were turning pretty ugly in this town. The boss's girl was gone, and part of me wished I was too.
Following the loss of Fabiana, we cut back to Max self-medicating, although it feels distinctly different this time. After the charity event, he drank himself into the ground until he couldn't stand, eventually throwing up with nothing else added to that. That scene comes across as if the events of the day barely registered with him at all, like it was just a minor interruption before slipping back into his usual routine. But after losing Fabiana, there's a noticeable shift. He takes pills, chases them with scotch, and then slowly lets his emotions take control. This time, the detachment isn't there the same way. It builds until he finally breaks a glass in his hand right over a newspaper article discussing the Galatians and Claudio. The Galatians were the football team Claudio played for, something that gets expanded on in the following mission. However, since Max barely knew who Claudio was, this feels less about him specifically and more like a reflection of everything that happened up until that point. It's a reminder that he just couldn't ignore. He was standing there with a drink in his hand while the girls were taken and Claudio was shot. His action, or more accurately, inaction during that time, carried consequences that stretched far beyond that night and continued to hunt both him and the Bronco family. His earlier suspicion that Fabiana would end up being held for ransom would go on to prove correct, as the following day, Passos and he would arrive with Rodrigo, Marcelo, and Victor to discuss the ransom note they received from the Comando Sombra regarding the return of Fabiana. The ransom note goes on to demand $3 million in exchange for Fabiana. Victor and Rodrigo deliberate over what the right call is. Victor is firmly in favor of paying, getting Fabiana back safely, and then going after those responsible afterward. He even suggests that this could be a move against him personally, possibly tied to his political campaign. Rodrigo, on the other hand, comes across as more confused than anything. The Comando Sombra isn't tied to any of the local favelas they usually deal with, and while Rodrigo has spent years paying off the right people and navigating corruption through bribes, ransom is something he's never really dealt with. It's not in his wheelhouse of expertise, and he doesn't understand why the Comando Sombra would be targeting him in the first place. Max has very little to add during this meeting. Aside from admitting that he has no experience with hostage negotiations, anyone who did that kind of work is back in the United States, left him without much to offer in that regard. So the only real suggestion he makes is volunteering himself and Passos to deliver the money to the Comando Sombra. Looking more closely at the timeline between the Broncos deciding what to do next and the actual ransom exchange, it all happens incredibly fast. The meeting between the Broncos and Max are at the Fabricas Bronco global headquarters, the company Rodrigo inherited from their father, with this meeting taking place at 9:17 p.m. Max and Passos then arrive at the designated exchange point, the Galatian Stadium, at 11:55 p.m. That leaves roughly a 2-hour window to organize everything, which already raises questions about how prepared they could have been. Beyond just this short time frame, there's the exchange itself and how it all falls apart, as it completely highlights a lack of precaution. Based on how the mission opens, Max and Passos arrive at the stadium after the Comando Sombra is already in position. They land directly in the center of the field, facing the wrong direction, and are immediately greeted by a group of armed men. From that point on, it appears since the very beginning that any kind of dialogue was opened up between the Comando Sombra and Rodrigo. The criminal organization dictated every aspect of that exchange. There's no verification that Fabian is even at the stadium, and from what can be seen, no clear plan or contingency in place to track these men afterward. If Victor's idea was to pay first and retaliate later, there's nothing here to suggest they made any real effort to set that up properly. This leaves major gaps in both preparation and contingency planning, problems that are quickly pushed to the forefront for Max and Passos to deal with as the already poorly organized exchange begins to fall apart. And it starts with a sniper position in one of the stadium towers, who opens fire on the Comando Sombra and ends up hitting Max in his left arm. As Max moves toward cover trying to get out of the sniper's line of sight, he recognizes the kind of weapon being used, a powerful long-range sniper rifle, something far beyond what he and Passos came prepared with. As if that even mattered considering he and Passos were already disarmed, though this leads him to admit that he feels decidedly amateur by comparison. Now realistically, that realization should have come much earlier, considering again the lack of planning and the absence of any real structure going into the exchange. All of it should have already made that abundantly clear. Getting shots isn't what should have exposed how unprepared they were, it just forces it into the open. Still, the hit itself becomes a kind of wake-up call for Max, the first real one in this situation. He mentions that he's been shot many times before, but this one feels different. There's a sense that whatever luck he's relied on up until this point is quickly running out, and this is a warning rather than just another injury he can simply brush off. As the two of them navigate through the stadium, they eventually make their way into an area of the stadium used for physical therapy and medical treatment for players. It's here that Passos gets the chance to properly patch Max up, and he does it well enough that Max not only loses feeling in his arm, but starts to feel completely numb overall. It's unclear whether that numbness is coming from the painkillers, Passos' work, or a combination of the two. Even so, their objective doesn't change. Their priority is still to make sure the Comando Sombra gets away with the money they brought. The hope is that by following through in the exchange, it prevents any confusion about who is responsible for the gunfire erupting across the stadium. If the Comando Sombra believed the Broncos were behind it, the consequences could be immediate and Fabiana's life would be put at even greater risk. And so Max and Passos begin moving through the stadium, trying to piece together who would have the motive and the means to interfere with the exchange like this, and more importantly, how they even knew it was happening. As they push forward, they start to form a clearer picture of the attackers. This third party aren't random gunmen or loosely organized criminals. They're well armed, well equipped, and operating at a higher level, sporting high-end body armor, again, powerful sniper rifles and military-grade submachine guns, all pointing to a level of organization and resources that goes far beyond not only what they were prepared to deal with, but pointing to just another random favela. At this point, it's not really necessary to walk through every single step of the encounter, so it makes more sense to focus on a few key elements here. Over the course of the stadium shootout, Max and Passos end up killing dozens of these attackers. That outcome doesn't just stay contained here either. It would directly feed into what happens much later when this same group launches an assault on the Bronco headquarters in an attempt to kill Max, something we'll get into further on. During the chaos at the stadium, the attackers ultimately succeed in taking the money from Max, Passos, and the Comando Sombra. So even without considering everything else that goes wrong, the exchange itself is a complete failure. Despite that, there is one critical piece of information that comes out of it. Passos overhears a member of the Comando Sombra begging for his life and While pleading for mercy, he reveals that Fabiano is being held in a heavily guarded location somewhere up the Tiete River. Another detail that stands out, especially in hindsight, is something Max himself questions during this mission: that despite the sustained gunfire, the explosions, and the sheer scale of the violence unfolding inside the stadium, no police ever showed up. At the time, it doesn't make much sense to him at all, and he even comments on that, but it's only much later, once everything begins to fall into place, that it starts to become clear as to why. For anyone familiar with the full story, the third faction that intervenes during this exchange is a paramilitary group known as the Cracha Preto. This group is made up largely of former police officers and members of UFE. Alvaro Neves, who appears multiple times throughout the stadium sequence and even allows Max and Passos to leave, stating they were only here for the money, is a former UFE member himself and is deeply connected to the organ harvesting operation that gets uncovered much later. So when you look at it from that perspective, Max noticing the complete absence of a police presence is not just a passing observation, it's a major warning sign. This wasn't a situation where help was delayed or unavailable. The attackers were tipped off about the exchange ahead of time, and because of their ties to both UFE and broader police corruption, there was never going to be any official response. The silence from law enforcement wasn't an oversight, it was part of the entire setup. It also raises the question of whether, if all of that had been known beforehand, Max's self-doubts would have taken hold as strongly as it does, as at the time, all he's left with is the outcome in front of him, and from his perspective, it's just yet another failure. Passos tries to frame it differently, pointing out that even though they lost the money, they at the very least came away with something valuable. They now know where Fabiano's being held, but Max doesn't see it that way. He responds with sarcasm, brushing it off as just another job well done, before meeting Passos' attempt at reassurance with the idea that trouble always seems to follow them the same way that Passos found him in the first place, and pulled him into the private security job.
At least we know where she is. Yeah, fantastic. Another good day's work. Trouble seems to find us, Max.
Sure, trouble finds us the same way you found me. Slumped in a bar, drunk on self-pity. I'd been sitting at the bar for 3 hours, or about 5 years, depending on how you looked at things. I tried not to look at things. I tried not to think about when it was that my existence became less about the things that make up people's lives, and more about the holes that losing those things leave behind. But I wasn't doing a very good job at it.
Now when you place this within the broader context of the overall story, especially considering that this entire sequence is being told as a flashback, it adds another layer to how Max is processing everything. This isn't just about the failed exchange or just the fact that a seriously well-financed paramilitary group completely crashed the ransom exchange with no idea as to how they even got tipped off of the exchange to begin with, but it's also part of the larger pattern in how Max has been coping, or more accurately, failing to cope with everything that's happened leading up to this exact point. The death of Mona Sachs, the collapse of his career as a police officer, and the weight of his past decisions all feed into this mindset. By the time we see him reflecting on the moment Passos found him at the bar in Hoboken, he's not exclusively reacting to the situation that's out in front of him now. He's actively looking for reasons to blame himself. Every setback reinforces this, and instead of recognizing that they managed to gain from this situation, he defaults to tearing himself down as much as possible. Playing through this story, this flashback doesn't just fill in gaps about Max, it also gives us more insight into Passos. From the beginning, Passos is deceptive. He lies to Max in order to lower his guard, presenting himself as someone connected to his past, someone familiar enough to be trusted, and he reinforces that by offering to buy Max a drink, easing into the interaction in a way that feels natural but is ultimately extremely calculated on Passos' part, especially if Passos was well aware of the habits Max has developed over the last couple of years. Now, the game never directly confirms Passos actually lying about attending the police academy with Max, but it is heavily implied. It's far more likely that this was simply a cover story, something that was believable enough to get close enough to him, and given how public Max's past was, it wouldn't have been difficult for Passos to piece together who exactly Max was. The harder part would have just been making that initial contact with him. Max's name had already circulated through news coverage, especially surrounding the events that led to his downfall. Remember, Max had graduated top of his class at the academy and earned recognition early on, which only makes the contrast with his eventual collapse all the more striking. And in the same mission, we also see evidence of just how public that downfall was through characters like his neighbor Brewer, who has an entire wall covered in newspaper clippings documenting Max's life. This all makes it that much more plausible that Passos knew exactly who he was looking for long before they ever actually met. It was just opening up that dialogue and finding some kind of way to convince Mac to come back with him and accept this new lease on life, this new purpose. If it hadn't been for the killing of Tony DeMarco, the son of a powerful mob boss, convincing Max to go along with Passos would have been a much harder sell, as that killing forces Max out of what little stability he had left, and in a way it pushes him into taking the job without fully thinking it through. Even then, once he does go with Passos, nothing really changes in how he carries himself. He continues drinking heavily, numbing himself and barely paying attention to what's happening around him. Their first job in Aruba is only talked about once or twice throughout the entire game, but from what it sounds like, all it did was reinforce his idea that this was going to be an easy job, that he can continue to feel sorry for himself, get paid, and somewhat travel the world. The second job is a job in Panama where, again, we see him basically drink himself to the point where he blacks out. But it's important to remember what actually triggers this whole flashback in the first place. It's Max's self-doubt, that persistent feeling that he's failed again. What happens at the stadium is what brings all of that to the surface. It forces him to reflect back on the moment Passos first approached him, and whether he was ever the right person for this entire job to begin with. Killing Tony is what pushed him to leave, but in doing so, he doesn't realize he was walking straight into something that mirrors his past. Another situation where he won't be able to save the girl. The difference this time is that he can't separate himself from it. It isn't something that you can just chalk up to bad luck or circumstance. In his mind, it's because he isn't okay, and he's aware of that. That line of thinking continues as they travel up the Tietê River, where Max starts to openly acknowledge his own faults, as he admits to Passos that if it hadn't been for his drinking back at the nightclub, none of this would have ever happened. It's him accepting responsibility and tying his condition to the ultimate outcome, reinforcing that idea that his failures aren't just situational but deeply personal.
You know, if I'd been doing my job properly, we wouldn't be out here in the middle of nowhere looking for some broad who got pinched on my watch.
That's what we tell ourselves, huh? It's all our fault.
No, I'm serious. By the time they grabbed the girls, I was half cut. I ain't slipping, man. I'm slipped. I'm a bad joke.
Max, we work private security. We're all ex-soldiers, ex-special forces, ex-cops, ex-good guys. We all have our reasons why we became ex. Maybe now we can put things right, okay?
The mentality continues as they once again fail to rescue Fabiana from the Comando Sombra. This time it isn't for any lack of effort on their part. The reality is that this particular area of the Tietê River is a well-known stronghold for the Comando Sombra, and Max and Passos quickly discover that they have no shortage of manpower or firepower at their disposal in this area. Even after tracking her down, first on foot through the compound and then continuing the pursuit by boat along the river, they're ultimately unable to actually wrestle her away from her captors. No matter how far they push into the area or how many men they fight through, it never leads to a successful rescue. And that failure carries directly into the final scene of the game, where Max is back in his apartment in Sao Paulo, drinking himself blind.
Fabiana had slipped through my fingers for a second time. Another habit I didn't want or need.
It was close. We almost had her. Damn.
I don't think we ever had much of a chance. No one told us they had an entire goddamn army.
I don't think anybody knew. Crazy shit.
Yeah. It's all crazy, pal. Non-stop insanity. Thought I left all this shit behind. Easy gig, you said. What a fool I was to get involved in this madness.
Like the previous scenes, the immediate read is that he's just once again numbing himself, but there are still clear differences when you look at the context surrounding it. In the earlier moments, there's a sense of detachment in how he drinks. It's just him doing the same old routine and ignoring what's happening. Here, that isn't really the case anymore. Despite his best efforts to make the ransom exchange work and then trying to recover the situation by taking the initiative and heading up the Tete River before Fabiana could be moved, it still ends in failure. And by this point, he's already openly acknowledged to Passos that this entire security job has been a giant mess. Something he was sold on under false pretenses. Those false pretenses and the belief that this entire job was just going to be an easy ride with him just kicking his feet up undoubtedly feeds into this entire scene. But another thing I wanted to point out here was at the start of the game, he says there's no real difference between Sao Paulo and the streets of Hoboken. Now, at that time, it's framed through his own mindset, how he sees himself in the cycle that he was stuck in terms of popping pills and just chasing them with scotch. Now, however, after everything that's happened, the constant firefights, the failed attempts to do his job properly, whatever that was even supposed to be, that comparison changes. It's no longer just something coming from his own habits or simply his perspective. The similarities between Sao Paulo and Hoboken aren't imagined anymore. They're reflected in everything happening around him. The violence and the ultimate outcomes all reinforce that same reality he thought he had left behind, which is something he also openly acknowledges to Passos. This is the last time he gets completely shit-faced, and it's the worst than anything we've seen from him up until this point. He passes out at the small table in his room, still in his underwear, surrounded by empty cases of scotch and the last bottle he'd been drinking from. Passos eventually comes in the next day and has to wake him up, and it's far from a gentle pushback into reality. He has to keep at him, throwing in a few jabs and making fun of him just to get Max to respond, to get him to move, make himself look presentable, and go meet with Rodrigo. It really does feel like the peak of Max's self-loathing. He lets it get completely out of control, right before having to go and face his boss after two major failures that he already holds himself responsible for. Ironically, it's his drinking problem of all things that ends up saving his life, as it's the very reason he survives what should have been a fatal bomb explosion, and in a way, it's also what finally pushes him toward getting clean, even if it did come at the cost of one final major slip-up.
Look at me. I've been contracted to protect two people. One was being held in some hole. The other was sitting at his desk with a bullet in his head. And the company that had its logo on my paycheck was melting on top of my head.
Following their failure to rescue Fabiana, Max and Passos return to Rodrigo, and they're met with his growing frustration. He lets his emotions get the better of him, lashing out and calling them clowns. Now, it's understandable given everything that's happened, but what stands out more is how the rest of the family responds, along with Becker's suggestion on what to do next. Victor steps in and tries to calm Rodrigo down, urge him to not give in to the idea of leaving Sao Paulo despite everything going on. He reassures him that as long as he listens to Becker and follows his lead, Fabiana will be returned safely. Now, at first glance, this entire thing comes off as a pretty straightforward exchange. Rodrigo's understandably shaken, worried about Fabiana, concerned for his own safety, and starting to lose faith in this city, maybe even in Brazil as a whole. But both Victor and Becker are clearly trying to steady him, to reestablish that sense of control and trust in them and in this whole situation. That becomes a lot more important when you consider who ultimately benefits from Rodrigo's death later on. But this scene then moves on to Victor telling Marcelo, Passos, and Becker to leave with him in the helicopter, all of them clearing out and leaving Max alone with Rodrigo. Goes on to be important later on as well, but the point here being that everything already surrounding Max are threads that continue to build as the story goes, all become extremely important here. For now, though, the focus turns to the private conversation between Max and Rodrigo after everyone else leaves.
I had so many plans, Max.
Didn't we all?
I was born into great fortune. Sometimes it feels like I have done nothing apart from being a rich man in a poor country. The men I talk to, they only see money. Now my wife, I am not naive. She does not love me for my body.
Well, despite your good fortune, you're still a decent man.
Am I? I don't know. I try to be. But maybe I'm just another rich fool, just like the rest of my friends.
Visually, the game makes it clear what matters here. The image distorts, drawing attention to Rodrigo questioning whether he's a good man, and referring to himself as a rich fool. And the answer to that is complicated. In the following mission, Max learns that Rodrigo had past dealings connected to the Cracha Preto, even if indirectly. As a real estate mogul, he was involved in land development, and through Victor, possibly on his own, he made use of Cracha Preto to clear out people living on the land that he wanted. Wilson da Silva later explains this to Max, making it clear that Rodrigo wasn't as good a man as Max initially believed. While that revelation is significant on its own, what really matters is how it impacts Max's perception of him. It adds another layer of doubt and confusion at a point where Max is already dealing with failure, uncertainty, and just overall a hard time, as it's the first time in years that he's fully sober, without alcohol or painkillers to dull any of his senses or to help take the edge off. We are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but as I said, Da Silva is the one to explain all this to Max, and coincidentally, Da Silva is also mentioned here, with his name being distorted and highlighted once Rodrigo's secretary walks into the room and informs him that Da Silva wants to speak with him. But without thinking twice or even slightly considering it, Rodrigo immediately dismisses him and brushes him off, referring to him as a bent cop looking for yet another contribution to his pension, or someone looking for another way to grease his palms. He even asks Max if he thinks a pile of shit thinks it's popular just because it's surrounded by flies. In other words, Rodrigo sees Da Silva as just another parasite, someone willing to look the other way for the right price. And, of course, that belief doesn't come out of nowhere. It's shaped by Rodrigo's own experiences with corrupt officials, the kind of people he's dealt with for years, his own feelings of being tired and in the presence of such people that see nothing but wealth, where money dictates loyalty, a kind of loyalty that he even is aware that his wife most likely lives by. At the same time, it's not hard to consider how much of that perception has also been influenced by Victor and Becker, especially given what we later learn about the both of them. Da Silva's actually the most subtle thread out of everything right now. He's one of the few genuinely honest and hardworking officials within Sao Paulo, someone who actively works against groups like Ufe and people like Becker and Bachmeier, who are more than willing to abuse their power. And it leaves you wondering what that phone call actually was about, what he was trying to tell Rodrigo before being brushed off. It's one of those giant questions that don't really go anywhere, because then their conversations cut short by armed men that enter the building because the security system had failed to respond. From here, Max is forced to take control of the situation on his own. He tells Rodrigo to lock himself within his office, instructs his secretary to stay where she is, and ends up dragging along the lone teenage IT worker, keeping him close while he fights his way through the building, where the goal is to eventually reach the security terminal and reboot the entire system. The whole thing is essentially a massive setup, and what makes it work so well is that everything is played out exactly how it was intended to from the start. Well, to a certain degree. At the same time, Max is completely tied up with dealing with the kid, trying to guide him through everything that's going on, and it doesn't come off like he's just doing his job either. He actually seems to care about what happens to him. You can see that especially in how he reacts later when he finds out the kid didn't survive and the person who killed him even went through his body afterward.
The kid hadn't made it. Fuck. I had to make this corpse-looting coward pay.
It clearly bothers him more than just another name added to the list. That same feeling kind of carries over to the others as well, especially the front desk secretary and Rodrigo. Whether it's directly his fault or not, it comes across like something he's going to hold on to anyways. As with the secretary, it's in the way he stops, closes her eyes, and makes that comment about her being killed by some hero fighting the rich one lonely secretary at a time. It's bitter, but it also says a lot about how he's processing it, the subtlety of which is just as significant as all of the shooting we take part in. Sure, Max's job is to keep Rodrigo safe, however, it doesn't stop him from being able to clearly see there has to be more going on here. Cracha Preto are hitting the building hard, utilizing multiple points of entry and sparing no expense in terms of firepower. Even if the additional security the building typically had was still around, the aggressive measures taken up by the Cracha Preto are extremely curious at best, while the total lack of any support for Max would be additionally suspicious. In the moment, he does try to make sense of it all, thinking either the attackers were expecting to come up on another lucrative payday like they did back at the stadium, or they had deeper business with the Bronco family than Max could have ever expected, and were now taking the opportunity that presented itself with a vulnerable HQ with Rodrigo barricaded inside with absolutely no protection whatsoever. What he didn't realize is that both of those assumptions were off. The reason they're there has nothing to do with Bronco. And it's not about another payout either. The entire thing is tied back to Max and what he did to them earlier at the stadium. This is retaliation, plain and simple. And they've effectively been turned loose with the understanding that taking him out is a priority. And while Max is caught up dealing with all the pressure coming from the outside, it leaves a gap that someone else is able to take advantage of. As with many other things, we don't know this just yet. We discover this very late, damn near at the end of the game, but it's Bachmeier, Becker's second-in-command or right-hand man within Ufe, who sneaks in through the roof via the helipad, completely avoiding all the gunfire erupting below. He then makes his way into the building without drawing attention, where he's unable to reach Rodrigo's office and kill him directly without any kind of interference. If everything had fully worked the way it was really supposed to, I think it would have been Prato focusing on Max, eventually taking him out, while Bachmeier simultaneously handled Rodrigo. From an outsider's perspective, it could easily be framed as Max being responsible for Rodrigo's death, whether that's then tied to Prato, or thus Victor, or maybe even Ufe taking the credit for killing Max, claiming he turned on his employer and thus he was taken out by either the police or the right-wing paramilitary militia. But of course, it still doesn't play out that way either. As Max makes it through the building alive after dealing with everyone inside, he eventually gets back up to Rodrigo's office, and that's when he finds his body. By then, whoever carried it out is already long gone, and the tape that could explain any of the events that had taken place within the office and explained who killed him and how he got away and how he came in is all gone. There's nothing left that shows any kind of responsibility belonging to anyone, and that would include how the bomb got under Rodrigo's desk and all the other ones wired throughout the building. It's a fully rigged building that would have killed him instantly, had it not been for Max acknowledging his boss was dead, immediately scavenging for a bottle of scotch within his desk, and while struggling to open it while talking of at least getting Fabiana back and hopefully there being some kind of hope and possibility of her returning, dropping her portrait, and then noticing that his desk was rigged to blow and he would have been killed.
Fabiana. Even if the man who employed me was dead, his wife was still out there. Maybe she could be saved. Maybe some good... Picking the photo from the broken fragments, something caught my eye. Figures.
I absolutely love the irony here. If it wasn't for Max immediately trying to find a way to numb himself and cope with what he just realized was being distracted so badly, he couldn't even protect his employer, scavenging for a drop of alcohol, then refusing to even navigate the basic idea of either putting Fabiana's portrait down or rearranging how he's holding everything, even showing just a tiny bit of self-restraint and wetting his whistle, he wouldn't have dropped that portrait, and thus he wouldn't have noticed the bombs. He says it was blind luck the blast didn't kill him, and really it's more blind luck that habit of his pushed him so far over the edge that his instinct to reach for the bottle and prioritize that over just basic common sense, that he wasn't killed immediately. After leaving the destroyed remains of Fabricas Branco's HQ, we get Max back at his apartment drinking again. Now I know I said the last time was really the last time, and I still stand by that because this time it is completely different from the rest of them. Here, he actually faces himself. He acknowledges this place is going to kill him if he doesn't do something about it, and decides if he's going to die, a real possibility based off of his decision to get Fabiana back, and learning the Prato have it out for him, it was going to be on his own terms. Admitting that he still wasn't thinking right and that his body's completely shot after years of drinking and popping painkillers without giving any of it a second thought. He hates himself, he hates the situation, and he's going to do the rest of his job from here on out sober. At the very least, he can have some say over that, and at least be able to see who was the person to finally put an end to Max Payne. And with that revelation and that ultimate decision, for the first time since the beginning of the entire game, Max's theme song takes over as he shaves his head and retakes control of his life as best as he can.
It was time to take back control from whoever was out to get me. And if I didn't flush them out, at least my midlife crisis would confuse them enough so they did something stupid. It was the only hope I had. I knew I wasn't thinking straight. I'd been drinking and popping painkillers for years. I had a liver like a French goose and skin like red leather. Well, it wasn't perfect. In fact, it wasn't much good at all, but it was gonna have to do. At least I was facing in the right direction.
This is his change, his mental decision to get clean and stop feeling sorry for himself. Well, he does technically go rogue, completely disappearing, cutting off contact from the rest of the Bronco family, making them believe that he was one of the dead within the explosion at Fabricaz Bronco's headquarters. It's his drive to steal the initiative from whoever was after him and rescue Fabiana that should really be highlighted here. We also witness him drink water in the moment as a way to sober up, and he does genuinely commit to it. The rest of the game, he stays clear from any alcohol, which is prominent when he makes the trek to head over straight to Nova Esperanza, a dangerous favela home to what appears to be 3 dangerous street gangs with the Comando Sombra, the group still holding Fabiana, is located. He got a tip from one of the Crash Alfredo members before they died, sharing that's where Fabiana is being held, and without any backup, Max took the initiative to head straight there. While it's amazing to see him take the first step in making everything right, he does make a minor error that will come back to haunt him later. Well, actually, he makes a few. For starters, as he's on the outskirts of Nova Esperanza, he calls Victor to inform him of where he is and what he intends to do, sharing Fabiana's location with both Victor and Marcelo. I don't mean to fault Max for sharing the details, as I think it was his attempt to reassure them he both knew where she is and fully intended to make this all right by at the very least rescuing her. However, this will all backfire later, as when Max does eventually reach the headquarters, or rather main hideout of Serrano, the leader of the Comando Sombra, Max would discover Marcelo and Giovanna had both decided amongst themselves it was a good idea to head to and speak with Serrano in an attempt to ransom Fabiana's freedom. Ultimately, that didn't work. Instead, what he did was take the cash and hold all 3 of them hostage, tripling the collateral Max had to worry about in the moment. The other mistake Max would go on to immediately make would be trusting the locals. Apart from knowing Fabiana was held in Nova Esperanza, the favela was as unknown and overwhelming to him as sobriety was. The most he ever experienced to Sao Paulo was the high-end nightclubs and cocktail parties of the rich. Now he was experiencing the side of Brazil where eyes are everywhere. Had he have been a little bit more observant, he would have caught on to the kid he trusted as a tour guide was actually sitting on the streets in filth, only to then disappear and reappear sometime later, offering to help him find the girl he was looking for. Really, it was nothing more than a setup where local gangs, that most likely command the part of the favela he was entering, robbed him of his gun and watch, kicking him into the gutter where the only way to get his bearings back is to, of all places, head straight for a bar up ahead in hopes of finding a phone where he can call Passos. Instead of managing to do that, though, Max is met with Wilson De Silva for the first time, actually introducing himself and having a direct conversation with Max. This is really where you start to see De Silva shift from someone who's been lingering around the edges of everything Max has been involved in, to someone who's now directly stepping into it and engaging with him face to face, being an active part. In fact, he'd become so active that he'd practically overtake Passos' position as Max's partner. But hearing this initial approach, he comes to Max under the pretense of something casual, offering to buy him a beer, but Max turns it down and goes with the soda instead, sticking to the decision he's been trying to hold on to when it comes to staying sober. From there, De Silva doesn't waste any time and starts laying out what he knows, or at least as much of it that he can fit into in the short window that he has. One of the first things he makes clear right off the bat is that he knows Max was set up back at Fabricas Brancas, which immediately tells you that this is far from guesswork on his part, showing that he's also much more capable than we could have ever initially expected him to be. Our best case has always been he's just another part of the police force, a regular cop, one that, as it would later turn out to be, was much more eagle-eyed and actively doing his own detective work on corrupt individuals and wasn't just another corrupt cop, as again Rodrigo initially expected him to be. It also pretty much confirms that he's been keeping an eye on Max for a while now, because it's not just that He understands what happened there. It's that he knew exactly where to find Max. And you can't really easily pull that off by chance, especially when Max ended up in this spot because he followed a kid who was clearly leading him in the wrong direction. You could argue it was coincidence that De Silva was just betting on Max falling back into old habits and starting to drink again, showing up somewhere like this before going after Fabiana, but then it still points back to how closely he's been tracking him. Either way you look at it, De Silva is clearly someone that isn't just randomly guessing. He's someone that has put time together in figuring out the bigger picture and figuring out where Max fit into all of this. And that becomes even more obvious once he starts getting into the bigger picture of his investigation. From De Silva's perspective, he shares that Serrano isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things. For everything Max and Passos have already done, the Comando Sombra are basically on their way out, and whatever influence they had is already collapsing. And so De Silva isn't focused on them anymore. And he pretty much advises Max to stop looking at them as a giant threat too. Instead, their attention is on two specific people instead, both of whom Max already crossed paths with back at the stadium. And those are the ones De Silva believes are actually worth worrying about moving forward.
Have you ever seen this guy? Sejano.
Yep, he's a real sweetheart.
Yeah, I'm sure put his gang out of business. But don't worry, those guys, they're a small fry. This is the guy I'm interested in. Neves. And this is his little buddy here. Milo Hegel. They work for this vigilante group, Rasha Preto.
Yeah, I know him.
Well, they're very popular with right-wing politicians, like Victor Branco. Now, you see, many years ago, he helped clear some villages on a bit of land Rodrigo Branco wanted to develop.
Rodrigo Branco?
Yes, he did some very bad things. Anyway, have you ever seen this guy?
Maybe at the stadium.
I knew you were involved in that business. You know, I wanted to investigate that, but I got an order to blame it on some local street kids instead. Tell me, what happened there?
I know we're focused on Max here, but I do want to point out what De Silva said about what happened at the stadium. He mentions he knew Max was involved with what transpired there, but was told to stand down and just blame it all on some street-level kids, further implying that there were other powers at play when it came to that whole exchange. De Silva naturally had his own instincts, but was ordered to not investigate it. Here, during the first interaction with Max, he clearly has already done a good amount of research on Crasha Preto, Comando Sombra, and Victor Branco, but he has yet to actually make any connections to Ufe, which is all revealed as Max further heads through the favela. Earlier we covered the relation between Ufe and the Crasha Preto. The next portion would be further uncovering the entire organ harvesting operation, and since it overlaps some more personal events to Max, I think it'd be better to cover the operation now, and then slowly, progressively, cover Max's more personal beats after on its own, rather than juggle the two simultaneously as they happen naturally in the story. Basically, as Max heads up to the headquarters of Comando Sombra, Ufe ends up raiding the entire favela with gunfight erupting between Ufe and street-level thugs. When the fighting eventually starts to die down, Max witnesses Ufe taking prisoners back with them and shooting anyone on the spot who attempted to get away. Having no other choice but to follow them, he'd witness Ufe, Bakmar specifically, selling people to none other than Mio Hegel with a Crasha Preto. They took the people while Ufe took the money, and the two would go on their separate ways. What this lays out is the first phase of how their partnership actually operates. Ufe essentially moves into the favela and carries out raids, take people into custody and effectively turn them into prisoners, where those same people are then handed off to the Crasha Preto, which is where things shift from a police operation, at least at first glance, into something much more organized and horrific. From there, these people are then moved into large groups, escorted under heavy guard, and done in a way that isn't even meant to be hidden. The next portion is something even De Silva is aware of, that these people, out in the open, are transported in large groups under heavily armed guards and sent into what appears to be an abandoned, rundown hotel named the Imperial Palace Hotel. And that's where the second part of the operation begins, and also where it reaches its final stage, with everything that was set in motion during those raids now being carried through to its endpoint. But again, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, let's return to De Silva speaking back at the bar. Drinking and sobriety aside, all these organizations, their part and Max's part within it all, only add to the overall confusion and difficulty of Max to keep up with it. Understandably, despite knowing Max was set up, sharing private information, and even being frank about potentially being killed when he does finally figure everything out, once it all starts to make sense, Max still doesn't truly trust De Silva. Even thinking it was all a load of garbage carefully crafted by De Silva. It's not like he's given much time to really sit on it or ponder how authentic it all was, as once De Silva leaves, a few men approach Max, resulting in a giant firefight within the bar that quickly spills out into the favela, all the way to where the Comando Sombra are, ultimately achieving the impossible of making that far by himself. A short-lived victory, since when he arrives at the top, the hostage negotiations are far from successful.
Here I was again, halfway down the world, and still looking at the bodies of women I was supposed to protect. Only difference now is, I didn't understand the language.
While Max's sobriety stands out as a major turning point in his character, as well as the overall trajectory of Max Payne 3's story, the outcome of what happens inside Serrano's headquarters is just as significant, if not more so, because it fundamentally changes everything that comes after it. Up until this point, Max has been a self-loathing drunk, someone who's simply going through the motions of private security work without much care for the consequences. That then evolves when he suddenly becomes someone who has failed at his job in such a spectacular way that he feels compelled to try and make it right by at least attempting to rescue his boss's wife. That attempt, however, fails almost immediately. Max would go on to confront Serrano and demand that he let the woman go, but instead of regaining control of the situation, he only escalates it, as Serrano responds by instantly putting a bullet in Fabiana's head right in front of him. At the same time, Giovanna and Marcello are taken away, with Marcello already wounded after being shot in the leg, leaving Max completely powerless in a moment where he had hoped to redeem himself. This is what ultimately triggers the final twist in Max's arc, where he begins to realize just how thoroughly he had been used by everyone around him. And that realization is framed through a return to his past, visually and emotionally, as he's taken back to the image of standing at the grave of his wife, Michelle, and their daughter, Rose. As he stares at the lifeless body of Fabiana, making the connection of again failing to save a woman, it's during this opening flashback that Max also admits hating himself, as well as the world for not being killed with his wife and daughter.
Here I was again, with all hell breaking loose around me, standing over another dead girl I had been trying to protect.
I'll give you a minute, buddy.
We'd only been married a short time. By now, she had been dead longer than I knew her. I still hadn't really forgiven myself for the Mona business, but I knew that was just grief. The insanity that comes with losing the life you had built. Michelle, I missed her with every part of my being. I hated the world for not killing me with her, and I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl.
With the whole stadium job, Max's flashback to how he met Passos was rooted in his self-doubt and search for understanding as to why he was ever brought into this line of work in the first place. Here in this flashback, it's triggered by his doubt, his trauma, and the hatred he harbored for so long for not being able to protect the woman important in his life. I would argue it's also a very strong moment to test his sobriety. Technically, Marcello and Giovanna are still alive, so perhaps there is some leniency there, basically saying there were others counting on him, and so he couldn't just relapse even if he wanted to, as he had other people depending on him and thus people to help keep him focused. But in the grand scheme of things, this is the final nail in the coffin. His direct employer and his wife were now dead. Marcello still had the Bronco name, and well, Max, in terms of him, still isn't able to make things right, as he ends up finding Mio trap him in a mound of tires and light him on fire, burning to death as Max is stuck helpless watching, and then eventually killing Mio and saving Giovanna. But here within this moment, back in Serrano's headquarters, and the significance of the flashback, apart from continuing the story as to how he ended up coming all the way to Brazil and accepting that work with Passos, if we cut out that mission, or more so move away from the gameplay and instead focus on the final cutscene and its transition back into the hideout of Serrano, it continues that line of thought of not being able to save people he's supposed to. And while during the beginning portion of the game where he is drinking, he is irritable and he is short with some people, he just isn't as angry or as annoyed as he is here or the rest of the game. And I think the beginning of those outbursts starts here, where he yells at the guy that shouldn't he have caught on by now that he doesn't understand his fucking language.
Fica nessa parede, seu americano de merda! Que porra tá acontecendo aqui? Que merda tá acontecendo aqui?
Haven't you figured out I don't speak your fucking language?
The subtlety in him being annoyed from the lack of alcohol is nicely layered on. It gets overshadowed as you're going through the events of the story naturally, but when you sit down and really just look at Max's mannerisms and how he interacts with people and processes a lot of the information, his temper and his reaction just seems to be a little bit shorter. Many of his decisions become a little bit more brash and reckless as well. Decisions like choosing to walk out and directly face Nevis after uncovering the horrors inside the Imperial Palace Hotel, or pushing through the front doors of the airport fully aware that security was on high alert and actively searching for him, all the way to his bold confrontation with Becker at the end of the game. All reflect the change in his behavior, as these are instances that are even acknowledged by Max himself as they happen, with him recognizing that they're not exactly his smartest decisions, which subtly highlights how much his emotions have begun to take control and shape the direction of the story. This trajectory continues in the aftermath of Fabiana's death. With her gone and the ongoing conflict between the Ufe and the criminals within the favela unraveling all around him, Max finds himself caught in the middle, engaging in gunfights against both sides just to survive. As mentioned earlier, during this descent through the favela, he directly witnesses the atrocities the Ufe commits against the locals, from taking prisoners and selling them off to the Crasha Preto to then ultimately killing Marcelo. At the same time, there is a sense of unstable balance in how events play out. Mio is killed by Max, effectively removing what appears to have been Neves' right-hand man within the Crasha Preto, while Giovanna is, at least temporarily, saved. The two of them would end up stranded together with no clear way out and increasingly desperate to get in contact with Passos, who has not been heard from since leaving the Fabricas Brancas headquarters alongside Victor, Marcelo, and Becker before the Crasha Preto launched their assault on the building. What complicates the situation even further is the realization that they are no longer just hiding from criminals, but from the police as well. In an attempt to avoid drawing attention, they decide to blend in with a crowd at a bus station, giving Giovanna a chance to call Passos. And while they do manage to reach him, the plan only partially works as their presence ends up attracting the attention of local police, pulling them right back into danger. The game then plays out a sequence where Max and Giovanna move through a bus station, keeping a low profile at first before things escalate into them hijacking a bus and driving it to a spot where Passos can hopefully pick them up. From a gameplay perspective, it stands out as one of my favorite missions, largely because Max ends up single-handedly holding off waves of heavily armed corrupt police officers, buying enough time for Giovanna to basically climb up a ladder and reach the roof of a building that they crashed into. Narratively, though, the moment carries its own major significance, as it marks the beginning of Max growing suspicious of Passos and his intentions. That doubt begins when Passos appears to abandon Max entirely, taking Giovanna and leaving without waiting for just an extra minute for Max to make it to the helicopter. Now, considering that the two are not only partners but implied to be close friends, that decision feels as if it was extremely intentional on Passos' part, and not as if it was just some rushed escape that he panicked in the moment. It comes off across as a complete lack of consideration, a willingness to just leave Max behind without a second thought, even if waiting just a few extra minutes could have made a difference. And this for Max acts as a reality check, forcing both Max and us to reconsider what their friendship actually meant. And that becomes even more painful when you take into account that Max had made Giovanna a clear priority throughout all of this, especially knowing that she was pregnant with Passos as a child, which makes Passos' actions feel even more detached and in a way, its own major slap in the face. When Giovanna tells Max that she's pregnant, she explains that she and Passos just wants to get away from all of this. It's an idea Max immediately understands, admitting that he once wanted the same thing, but that it never worked out that way for him. It's a connection that quietly ties back to his wife and daughter, and even to his more recent desire to escape the constant gunfire and ever-present feeling that death is always right around the corner. But the realization that Passos may have left him behind lingers, and while it sits with him for a moment in isolation, the confusion and betrayal turns to frustration and anger the more he thinks about it. And what really pushes that suspicion further is the sudden and well-timed arrival of De Silva. De Silva's presence reinforces the idea that Max is being watched more closely than we might have ever realized, or he could have started paying even more attention to Max after their initial meeting at that bar back in Nova Esperanza. Whatever the case is, he ends up picking Max up right after he just killed a number of police officers and takes him to a parking garage where they continue De Silva's investigation on everything. It's here that De Silva also reveals that he's been looking into Passos, uncovering details that complicate everything Max thought he knew. While Max has always maintained that he was only ever being paid by Rodrigo Branco, De Silva explains that Passo has been receiving payments from Victor, payments that he was able to track on 6 separate occasions, with some of those payments dating back to months before Max and Passos ever met in the bar back at Hoboken. And then that meeting itself is called into question, as De Silva reveals that Victor was the one who paid for Passos' flight to New York, where he then introduced himself to Max under the pretense that they had attended the academy together. From De Silva's perspective, it all makes sense. He already understood that what happened at Branca's headquarters was a setup for Max. He also had the suspicion that Max was involved with the shooting back at the stadium, which Max later confirmed, and now that Passos, without thinking twice, just left him behind, and already knowing that there was some shady, secret payments being made from Victor to Passos, that's, well, there is much more going on here. And for Max, who's struggling to understand it all and frustrated with everything else, he puts it simple. They needed someone angry and easy to steer, a dumb gringo to stand watch over Rodrigo while the pieces were being put into place for him to be taken out and accept the fall. And if none of it is fully clicking for Max, De Silva narrows it down to a single question. What did Max think he was really doing back in Panama? Did he actually believe they were just there to guard an old woman? The Panama job, we've been circling in the background throughout this entire discussion, so rather than getting lost in every detail, it comes down to this. It was a job Max and Passos ultimately failed at. The woman they were meant to protect, named Daphne Bernstein, was killed, and Max, looking back on it, admits in a way that is almost embarrassing that he was so drunk at the time he could barely even remember his own name. But what he was able to recall almost immediately was an action on Passos' part. It was his decision after Max cleared the boat of all its assailants and finally made contact with Marcelo and Passos, who were loading up a truck to let Marcelo go on ahead by himself and decide to tag along with Max in search of any survivors that may be currently held as hostages. A decision and move that he ultimately didn't have to do. And at the time, that decision reinforces Max's belief that Passos was a good guy, someone he can trust, but in hindsight it ends up distracting from what the job may have actually really been about. The growing implication that the real objective had less to do with protection and more to do with Marcelo and Passos actually smuggling cash into the country for Victor. And that lines up with what they're seen doing, loading bags into the truck that Marcelo eventually drives off with, while Max and Passos head off in a different direction under the assumption that they were trying to save whoever might still be alive, only to find out everyone was slaughtered. Now, Max will later on admit that he did not see Marcelo again for another week until they all arrived in Brazil, and that he had no real understanding of what Marcelo had been transporting, nor did he ever give it a second thought. Instead, he accepted the explanation that Daphne Bernstein had been targeted by people connected to her messy divorce, never really questioning it at the time. And that assumption becomes harder to take seriously once De Silva points out that Daphne's ex-husband was a Wall Street worker who had no connection to anything resembling Panamanian death squads, or the people that essentially attacked the yacht. Another beautiful thing about this game and the overall details of everything is, technically, that whole mission and information could have been left right here. But later on, when Max storms the UFE headquarters, specifically the unit Becker was in charge of, inside there's a documentation identifying those so-called Panamanian death squads De Silva was referring to. Their official name was the AUP, or the United Souls of the People. They were a right-wing paramilitary group, and the files that Max ends up finding outline their activities, what they're known for, and more importantly, they reveal that the Brazilian police had potentially tipped them off about the yacht, giving them advanced knowledge of the money on board, who they were looking for, and when it was supposed to arrive. It explains why they were seen tearing apart parts of the ship, clearly searching for something specific, although Max was never able to identify what. And since he had no knowledge of the money, then it made sense at that point in time that he wouldn't be able to connect those dots. With Victor's connection to both Becker and Passos, and with Passos and Marcelo seemingly directed to deliver that money to a banking contact in Panama, the situation starts to look less like a failed protection job and something more akin to what's actually going somewhat according to plan. But it does raise the possibility that this may have been one of the earliest setups, either an attempt to get Max killed or to position him as the one who would ultimately take the fall for the job going wrong and for the deaths that followed. Since Passos consistently seems to walk that line between deliberately using Max and simply being caught up in the same kind of tunnel vision that Max himself falls into, it's difficult to say with complete certainty where he really stands. However, because Passos becomes such a central focus at this point, reevaluating the Panama job along with the revelation that Victor had been paying him separately and even funded his trip to New York does serious damage to both their friendship and Max's overall perception of him. That damage only deepens when De Silva further explains that out of all the Bronco brothers, Rodrigo was the only one with real money. I'll come back to that in a moment, but for Passos there's another detail worth pointing out, as it's one that ends up as another significant blow to Max personally. After De Silva drops him off and he storms the Imperial Palace Hotel to figure out why large groups of people are being brought inside, despite it not being a police station or any kind of public facility, during that search, Max eventually comes across a piece of paper that's an exact copy of Passos' own ID, confirming that he has been placed on the Crusher Prado's hit list, which is not particularly surprising, given everything that has happened. What is surprising, though, is that he learns about Passos' background. Contrary to what he had claimed, Passos is not in fact Brazilian at all, but Colombian. It's a small detail, but one that suddenly reframes earlier moments, especially when Max reflects on how locals would occasionally laugh at Passos' accent, something that didn't fully register at the time, but again recalling to the mental state that he was in, his priorities, and just kind of going through the motions of everything. It points out just how little things perked up his ear due to either not caring or just simply not paying attention. At the same time, though, the broader picture around the Bronco family becomes even clearer. Marcelo and Victor may have lived well, but Rodrigo was the only one who truly held the power and the money. And he was also the one funding Victor's political campaigns. It's a dynamic that becomes extremely important now that both Rodrigo and Marcelo are dead, turning the situation into a highly public tragedy for someone running on a law and order platform. Because now he can relate to the common people, as he suffered personal tragedies relating to the causes that he's directly fighting against. Within this context, it starts to resemble a familiar pattern of corruption where the problem is created, then controlled or contained just enough that only certain people fully understand it before eventually being stamped out once it has served its purpose. And in this case, it's Victor essentially using Ufe and the Crusher Prado. But what does the Imperial Palace actually have to do with any of this? Within the larger structure connecting the Crusher Prado, the Ufe, and Victor, the answer is quite a lot. At the same time, this is a video about Max, not a full plot breakdown, and it is fair to say the focus has leaned a little bit too heavily into that direction over the past few minutes, so it's worth bringing the attention back to Max, specifically how he processes everything he's walking into. And that starts with the mindset he carries with him as he heads down into the basement of the Imperial Palace Hotel, followed by the comments he makes along the way just before he comes across the prisoners taken from the favela, and the doctor hurriedly trying to conceal the organs he had just removed before desperately offering Max money in exchange for his safety. The mentality Max brings into this space can be summed up with a single word: clarity. His opening monologue as he enters the basement sets that tone.
It was the question I kept on asking myself. How could I have been so blind? I was convinced the Broncos had gotten the wrong man for the job, but maybe De Silva was right. I was the stooge. The bad joke everybody got but me.
And that sentiment continues to build later as he moves further inside, at one point even reflecting on finally being able to catch a glimpse of himself in a kind of metaphorical mirror, reaching a point where he can at least momentarily acknowledge and understand what everyone else has been seeing when they looked at him. And that is where the real significance of this mission sits when looking at Max's character more analytically. The moment that really brings all of this together is once again the return of the pianos. Earlier I mentioned that Max choosing sobriety marked the first time his theme begins to come through. But this is the first point where it fully comes together through the piano motifs that have been scattered throughout the game. Every previous attempt had been incomplete, thrown off by his inebriated state and the fact that he simply was not in the right frame of mind. Here though, just before he fully grasps the extent of the horrors the Crusher Prado are carrying out inside of the building, he finally gets to tune and cadence correct. He even describes it as a soundtrack to his life, and for a brief moment, everything falls into harmony.
There it was, the soundtrack to my life. And for a few seconds came harmony. Finally.
That quiet, satisfied finally subtly signals a change in who Max is at this point in the story. He's come to terms with the fact that he was used, that he was too blind to see what was happening around him, and that his anger, misery, and personal vices were all leveraged against him. Yet even with all of that laid out before him, he never once expresses a desire to drink or a longing to fall back into that version of himself. There are still small acknowledgments, admittedly, of his habits through gameplay, particularly when it comes to painkillers, where he will occasionally remark that not all habits die, or that you cannot erase what you have seen, but you can still dull your senses. Those comments do complicate the idea of him being completely clean, but at the same time, they exist within a gameplay system that needs to function, as that's basically your health. So because of that, it feels fair to give those moments a bit more leeway than his relationship with alcohol, which the story treats with far more deliberate intention behind it. Speaking of alcohol, anger, and hatred, and the way those elements are subtly played on throughout the story, they never actually disappear. Instead, they change targets. Rather than being turned inward, with Max destroying and numbing himself by finding a bottle and locking himself up within his room, they begin to manifest outwardly, and him coming close to destroying everything around him. And that change is made literal when he plants C4 along the support beams of the Imperial Palace Hotel. By the time he finally comes face to face with Neves, Max goes on to detonate the explosives while attempting to wipe out what remains of the Crusher Prado operatives. The confrontation ultimately ends with Passos, of all people, stepping in and saving Max's life by shooting Neves in the head, who had Max unarmed on his back. Even here, though, Passos remains firmly in a morally gray area, and that uncertainty immediately comes back into focus when Max confronts him about bringing him to Brazil under false pretenses, essentially lying to and using him. Because the game never actually fully clarifies what Passos actually knew, it is difficult to land definitively on one interpretation or the other. I mean, after saving Max's life, Passos does admit that he was aware Victor and Marcelo wanted to teach Rodrigo a lesson and get him to loosen his grip, admitting that he was aware of their dissatisfaction with how the family's finances were being controlled. Beyond that, however, the specifics become very unclear as to what that lesson was supposed to look like, how far it was meant to go, and what the intended end result was, are all details that are never fully spelled out. Because if Passos truly understood the situation beyond the surface level, it becomes harder to reconcile some of his actions. It raises the question of whether he would have willingly gone along with the things like the stadium hostage exchange, or the events along the Tietê River, if he had known how far everything would go on to escalate. At the same time, there are details that complicate the bigger picture as a whole as well. Marcelo, for instance, while Passos admits was on board with Victor with teaching Rodrigo a lesson, did appear to genuinely care about Fabiana. And Fabiana herself is a direct connection to Giovanna, the woman Passos cared about as well. That overlap makes it extremely messy to pinpoint where Passos was in all of this. So even if Max was in some sense meant to take the fall, the full extent of what was planned and most likely kept tightly contained probably was only known to Victor and Becker. That would leave Passos operating on a very limited need-to-know basis, although even what he did know was already enough to put him in the wrong, especially when it came to convincing Max to come to Brazil under the promise of simple, straightforward work, and as he put it back in Hoboken.
I can get you work, Max. Work that only a guy like you can do.
But why does Passos' betrayal matter so much? Why is that what Max fixates on while the Imperial Palace is literally collapsing underneath his feet? When you think about it, it's a deeper answer than just him being focused on what's directly in front of him. Because really, it's not just about Brazil. For years, Max had been drifting through life, popping painkillers, and convincing himself he didn't care what happened next or what happened to him. He had lost his family, his career, and just about every meaningful relationship he ever had. By the time Passos found him sitting in that bar in Hoboken, Max had already given up on the idea that things could get better. Then someone came along and offered him a way out. Was it salvation? Any form of redemption? No. It was just a reason to keep moving. A friend, a partner, someone who understood him and came from the same background he did. A connection that was further deepened as he got more and more into this job, because while Passos lied about being familiar with Max back in the academy, he was an ex-cop. Even De Silva confirmed that. And it does recall that conversation that they had up the Tietê River, that Passos tells Max that they're all ex-something. They all hide from their mistakes and they all became ex for a reason. In other words, it was a bond that was formed off a lie, but was only strengthened as time went on, off of things that felt genuinely real. Then as he's learning that initial interaction was possibly built off of a lie, and he was lied to various times throughout his tenure working with Passos, the man who pulled him out of Hoboken wasn't just a friend looking to help. He was now part of a giant, complicated plan centered around manipulating Max from the very beginning. The betrayal hurts because it forces Max to question one of the last relationships that he still believed in. Not whether Passos cared about him, but whether any of it was ever real in the first place. It's difficult to extract fact from fiction, and he was finally sober enough to confront it, to make his decision on what to do with Passos and how to move forward, and that decision ends with a very heartwarming goodbye between the two of them, shown immediately in the next cutscene, with Max wishing Passos and Giovanna the best for themselves and their unborn child. Giovanna thanks Max for letting them have a chance to be a family, and Passos having his last words being having Max take care of himself. And as he says, to remember, life is worth living. A reminder of the personal hell he was in, and a warning for the suicide mission he was about to unleash over the next 24 hours. Completely embodying the killer Victor has always envisioned him to be. The only real difference now is that Victor himself becomes a target, with Max set on bringing down everything Victor had struggled to build in the process. This is the point where Max, after having De Silva look over the information he recovered from the Imperial Palace, learns that Becker is behind everything. While many people already knew, at least privately, that Becker was involved in murder and weapons dealing, his connection to human trafficking and the harvesting and selling of human organs comes as something of a huge shock. Which is interesting, especially to De Silva, because it's the first time he's ever able to connect Ufe as being involved in any particular way. Clearly he did his homework and was able to understand the role Crusher Prado was expected to play. He understood the past working relationship behind Victor and Passos pretty well, and even came to the conclusion as to why they would look out into New York and bring Max in. But since he even acknowledges that publicly that he knew Victor and Becker were quite close and that Becker was a government agent that even openly supported the political campaign of Victor, it's always been one of those weird elements to me that he was never able to say it. Or maybe he did understand it, and he also understood that if he ever actually made that connection or even dared to make that connection, then he, along with his wife and kids, would be killed. Something he makes quite apparent as being a real possibility and is even the reason as to why Max is the one that has to kill Becker. Maybe it really was all about walking that line as carefully as possible, staying just far enough from the full truth until he got too close to ignore it. Ufe's role ends up shedding light on everything, and it makes it feel more believable that he likely already suspected something but chose not to openly accuse anyone or any organization until he had something concrete. Now he does. It becomes irrefutable. And so that responsibility then shifts over to Max, who now heads to Ufe's headquarters with the intent of putting Becker 6 feet under. Now, instead of focusing purely on the narrative events, there is smaller details throughout this mission that stands out, that I think is much more important to cover. I've pointed out multiple times how Max changes and evolves throughout the story, usually through the larger, more obvious plot developments that happen over time. But in this specific mission, that change is felt from the beginning to the end, and you can actually see and hear it within Max's own monologues. The first of which, I want to begin with the irony where all of this takes place. It all unfolds within a police precinct. When you consider the timeline from Max Payne 2 to Max Payne 3, there's roughly a 9-year gap. During the events of Max Payne 2 was the last time he was a police officer, taking place in 2003. The events of Max Payne 3 take place in 2012, and here he was again, although under completely different circumstances. Or was it? Sure, here he was storming through the station, killing officers left and right like some cheap angel of death on the opposite side of the law here, fighting for his own personal reasons, and yet, as he says here, is another dark, rainy night, another police station, another futile crusade for amends. Time moves forward and nothing changes. It directly echoes the visual and emotional language of Max Payne 1 and 2, where police stations were places tied to his identity either as a cop trying to do his job or as someone barely clinging to that identity while his personal life continued to collapse. Back then, even when he was at his lowest, there was still a framework that he believed in or was able to follow. He was operating within the idea of justice, even if the methods that he enacted got messy. Now that same setting shows up again, but it's hollowed out. He's no longer part of that world in any real sense. He's not navigating the system of working alongside it, but instead rampaging through it. The fact that he's killing police officers inside a precinct flips the meaning of the space entirely. What used to represent order, or at least the illusion of it, is now just another obstacle within his way. Then there's his mentality and his own assessment as he rampages through the precinct, beginning with this line.
Another dark, rainy night. Another police station. Another futile crusade for amends. Time moves forward, and nothing changes.
Calling himself a futile crusade for amends is where I think it gets even deeper. Earlier in his life, Max's actions were driven by grief and revenge, but there was still a sense, however fragile, that what he was doing might lead somewhere. There was a belief that if he pushed far enough, endured enough, or punished the right people, something might be resolved. That maybe he could balance the scales or at least quiet whatever was left of his conscience. But as he's going through the police precinct and he starts killing all these officers, that belief is completely gone. He still moves forward, continues to fight and kill, but he no longer frames it as something meaningful. Calling it a crusade acknowledges that he's acting with purpose, but calling it futile then undercuts that purpose completely. He's admitting in real time that none of this is actually going to fix anything. It's action without any form of resolution. Then his saying if time moves forward and nothing changes ties it all together. Because really, at first glance, everything has changed. Different countries, different enemies, nearly a decade of distance from his past life. And he's finally sober again, but internally Max recognizes the pattern hasn't changed at all. He's still caught in the same cycle. Violence, guilt, the illusion that the next step might be the one that finally means something, but it doesn't. And he catches this somewhat early in the mission, and that same line of thought continues later when he says this.
It was starting to feel as if I'd never leave that place. Like one of those nightmares where you keep running and running only to discover you're chasing yourself.
When he says it's starting to feel like he'll never leave that place, I heard someone say that that was their belief that this was the first time he ever expressed any real concern of dying. And while that may be plausible with that acknowledgement and not seeming to hate himself as much as before, I think it's more of a psychological acknowledgement that he feels like he's being trapped in this loop where the environment stops feeling like a real finite location and starts feeling more like the state of mind that he's in. The station becomes interchangeable with every other place he's fought through before. And so it's a continuation of that same cycle of violence that he's been stuck in for years. As I said, continuing that same vein of thought that he started earlier in the mission. The nightmare comparison is where I think it suggests that the conflict isn't actually external anymore either. Earlier in his life, Max could point to clear enemies, people responsible for his loss, people he could pursue, confront, and blame. There was always someone else at the center of what was going on. Here, even though he's still fighting real people, the feeling underneath it is that none of them are the true source of what's driving him. The violence keeps going, but it doesn't feel like it's leading him toward anything concrete. Instead, it just loops back on itself. Chasing himself implies that the thing he's been trying to outrun, his guilt, his past, his consequences of everything he's done, is of course inseparable from him. No matter how far he pushes forward or how many people he goes through, he ends up right back at the same place internally. The more he runs, the more he reinforces that cycle. It also contrasts pretty sharply with earlier Max. In Max Payne 1 and 2, the nightmare feeling was there, but it was tied to trauma and confusion. He was disoriented because everything had been taken from him and the world didn't make sense to him anymore. In Max Payne 3, specifically at this point in his mission of sobriety and I think also trying to find a reason to continue to live and push forward, the nightmare is different entirely. It's not about not understanding what's happening, it's about understanding it well and realizing that it doesn't really change anything. So when you put those lines together, you get a pretty complete picture of where he's at mentally. You recognize the pattern, he knows it's not going anywhere, and now he's starting to feel like he can't even step outside of it. But there is one more line that he says just a little bit later that I think really drives all of this home. creating this transition of entering this mission being incredibly angry, knowing what he's coming here for, coming after the people that used him, to then acknowledge the irony in the position that he's in, starting to feel like he's basically chasing himself, and then coming to another moment of depressing clarity. There are actually two lines that are technically said back to back, but depending on how you play the game, they might be a few minutes apart from each other, so I'm going to play them both, because I think they're very closely tied together.
Another pile of bodies and still nothing to show for it. I felt like I was detaching, that maybe this was revenge for something else, something buried deep in the past. Rodrigo, Giovanna, Passos, everyone who'd meant anything was gone. Like so many times before, I'd found myself alone, locked on a course of destruction. It was at my worst when I was at my best.
So I want to break this down bit by bit. Another pile of bodies and still nothing to show for it is again him stripping everything down to its most honest form. He's already acknowledged that no matter how many people he's killed, change is ultimately nothing, and he says it again basically right here. And then he continues by saying he feels like he's detaching, considering he is also sober now. In the past, that numbness could be blamed on alcohol or painkillers. It was something he was using to dull the edges of what he was doing. Here, he doesn't have that excuse anymore. The detachment is coming from him and solely him, not from anything he's taking or his desire to lean over to the bottle and numb himself, detaching himself from what he was doing. It suggests that this emotional distance has become a default state, not a side effect of the alcohol or the painkillers. A default state that he can finally acknowledge because, well, he's not inebriated. Then we move on to the line about maybe this was revenge for something else, something buried deep in the past. With that comment, he now starts looking inward in a way that he really hasn't done in this entire game. Earlier, yes, he would take it out on himself by drinking and numbing himself, and then later that revenge would be pointed outward at specific people tied to specific events. Now he's questioning whether any of this is actually about Becker or Victor or even the current situation at all. It starts to feel like all of it is just an extension of something unresolved that goes all the way back to his family, to New York, to everything that set him on this path in the first place. It's a way for him to really look to the core of his problems and the core of why he was hating himself for such a long time without the game forcing it so much on you. And then by the time he says everyone who'd meant anything was gone, he's not just listing names, he's reinforcing the pattern of loss that keeps repeating no matter where he goes. Rodrigo, Giovanna, Passos, they're completely different people from different parts of his life. He doesn't say anybody older, Mona, Michelle, Rose, his daughter, his wife, his love interest, and I think there's a few reasons for that. First, they all end the same way, gone, leaving him in the same position he's always been in. The timeline doesn't feel as cohesive since he refers to people that he's recently met, but I think that's just as important that he's named those people off, because for Rodrigo that signals his failure, his inability to pull himself from the bottle to be able to focus on what was directly in front of him. Giovanna, I think, was an extension or a modern representation of Michelle, the pregnant love interest, the person who was an opening to a life that he really wanted and seemed to love for the short period of time that he had it. And then Passos, the friend, the partner, the person who understood where he was coming from and understood everything he was going through. These are three different people that gave him three different purposes to look forward, to be able to continue to keep going and not destroy himself or just leave him to his own devices and wallow away in a room. They gave him hope, a chance to look forward and do more with his life, and they genuinely meant something to him. But now they were all gone. Here he was, again, alone. And then he says locked on a course of destruction, tying it back to the early idea of this nightmare that he's stuck in. It feels like for him this is all predetermined, like once he starts moving there's no real way for him to step out of what he was doing. That loss of agency is what makes it feel so bleak. He's aware of what he's doing, but that awareness doesn't translate into him changing what he's doing. Then he closes it all out with saying, "It was at my worst when I was at my best." Probably the clearest self-assessment he gives. This is Max functioning at a very high level. He's focused, he's efficient, completely in control of himself, to a point. Especially now that he's sober. But that best version of him is also the version that's most capable of destruction. The more composed and effective he becomes, the more damage he's able to inflict. So sobriety doesn't save him here, it almost sharpens the problem that he's now finding himself in. There's no haze, no distortion. He's now able to see everything clearly, what he's doing, why he might be doing it, and how little it's actually accomplishing anything. And yet he continues to do it anyway. And that's what makes this mission, this stretch, so different from the rest of the game, because he single-handedly makes this transition, this acknowledgement throughout this single mission. It's someone who understands his own patterns and still caught inside of it, fully conscious of everything that's costing him, and yet is still determined to see it through. A determination that continues with him to the airport, where he succeeds in killing Becker, where the game begins and he takes a moment to reflect on how he really did become everything that they wanted him to be, to then refraining from killing Victor, although he does leave him with a nice alteration for the rest of his life.
You know I'll walk. You'll walk with a lift!
What is there really left to say about this ending? Should I use the typical terminology most people fall on, that it's a masterclass in visual storytelling, implying Max is finally moving on, he found his will to live and is done beating himself up? God, I hate that word as much as I hate hearing the word trope thrown around, but really, details are important here. Max is of course sitting at a bar on a beach hearing street justice was indeed carried out. The 55th Battalion of Ufe was indefinitely disbanded. Victor was found hanged in a cell, framed as a suicide with strong evidence he was in fact killed by one of the many people affected by his organ harvesting scandal. While it's tempting to just leave it at they lost and Max in the end won, there's a much different victory at play here. Max is sticking to being sober, having his regular soda with no side of bottle of scotch around. And as he gets up to walk away, the literal last thing the weather woman can be heard saying is mentioning how it's dark in some places but sunny everywhere else. There's a brighter future. He mentally appears to be in a better place and now is really at his best and free to do as he so pleases. These are many different subtle confirmations, or at least reinforcements to the idea and hope that Max finally found some form of peace. He isn't this guy continuing to drink himself blind, losing hope in everything. I'd actually argue he's even stronger than ever before, because he got tested in a way few people ever bounce back from. He was pulled from a dark place, learned the person he trusted that pulled him out of such of a dark place and gave him hope, built that all off of a lie, and still from there, he decided to stick to his own choice of becoming sober, despite being exposed to some of the worst parts of humanity, and even recognizing in real time his own destructive tendencies, almost proving the people who used him right and seeing him as nothing more than a killer. He still chose the harder path in the end. And because of that, the beach scene will always feel genuinely earned.